This is Michael Hexter. Welcome to Politics 2100 here on YouTube. So this episode I'm calling The Left's Pacifism / Rousseauvianism is challenged by Putin's war, Ukrainian complexity. So, Ukrainian complexity. So, I am seeing both in social media and elsewhere ongoing issues that I have touched on in other episodes, and I want to sort of take a step back and try to understand this moment, because we're dealing with a historical change, so a watershed moment in our history, not just for this community of people we call the left, but also more generally for societies, for overall, across the political spectrum, even for people who are relatively apolitical. And we're entering a period where we might possibly be starting a third world war, okay, which is a grim prospect. And it's not us that's starting it, it's Mr. Putin that's starting it. But it basically, this offensive on the European continent, where the first two world wars were started, creates dangers for neighboring countries, not only obviously Ukraine, which is experiencing death and destruction right now, and will likely experience more of that, but also for other nations. So there's basically there's nuclear blackmail going on, so we have to take that into account and really name it. So Putin is using the threat of nuclear war to engage in conventional war at his border, and when he chooses, and is daring other countries to take him up on this challenge. And that gets to the question that I asked a few episodes ago about how much of a apocalyptic nihilist is Putin. So if you conclude he is a apocalyptic nihilist, he doesn't care whether he lives or dies, or he just wants to make a big mess. He wants to, rain down destruction, and it's either his way or annihilation, that he will effectively be able to use, or certainly if he has the reputation of being an apocalyptic nihilist. If he isn't actually one, that's something else. But anyway, that he will use that blackmail tool to continue to wage war as he pleases and exert political power over neighboring countries, most likely within Europe. And so, and this creates then the prospect of rearmament of, increased armament of the entire European continent, so as to make certainly the conventional war, unlikely to succeed, and that's not so hard for those countries to do. But certainly at this moment, Ukraine is not prepared for the full force of the Russian army and air force and so forth and so on. So anyway, this presents a challenge for everybody. There are certain groups who obviously are welcoming this. There are Russia hawks of various kinds. There are obviously the prospect of arming lots of countries and producing weapons is a great boon for the armaments industry, for the military industrial complex, and it creates a rationale for a new Cold War, or if not a open war, let's say, right, well, we have an open war right now, but a wider open war. So anyway, so this challenge is also particularly a challenge for the left, because the left holds itself to higher standards than most politicians, or most, and is attempting to appeal to the better nature of human beings, and to also not only appeal to that, but to build a new society based on our better natures, and to also just face practical common issues of facing humanity, facing a given national community, and face those with better public policy, with proactive action, with a sense of both social solidarity, with human equality within some bounds. Again, not we found that if you demand total equality, total as happened, for instance, or Pol Pot's regime, or so forth and so on, or in the Cultural Revolution during the 1960s in Maoist China. So that has enormously destructive impacts on society. But anyway, the left tries to realize some of the better, and so it's been a fumbling process. So, and this is where, I am of the belief that we need to revise, among other things, Marxism, and and critique it, and potentially overthrow its position within the left's intellectual and other ideologies. Not just, I'm just using that as probably the most developed and most influential strain of left thought. But anyway, and we need to have a better theory of society, theory of change, theory of governing, theory, so forth and so on. So that will bring this will harness our human capacity, our better capacities, our and our cooperative capacities, our ability to cooperate with each other, to create this better society, but also simply now a society that will survive into the next century, and that's not at all likely given the current trajectory of our current society. And obviously also there's a critique of capitalism there. So the big C word, the capitalism, the left has a critique of capitalism, in which it rightfully sees as being a destructive system that is not sustainable. Okay, and but on the other hand, the Marxist critique of capitalism has not produced a workable solution to the problems of capitalism either. So anyway, but this is a sidebar to the main question here. So also the left, since the 1960s, or even the 50s and the 60s, has been a pacifist left. In other words, pacifism has been, or war resistance, or has been, disarmament has become one of the main issues on the left, and with good reason. So there was there is still, and so this is an unresolved issue, the nuclear standoff between the two superpowers, or three superpowers now, but mostly still two nuclear superpowers that created the nuclear disarmament movement in Britain and also the United States, and which revived itself in the 1980s again, which was revived in the 1980s, and then but then also anti-imperialist tradition especially that gained steam in the United States in the 1960s and remains one of the go-to ideological homes of the left. So so the pacifism of the left is based on what I call also Rousseauvianism. Okay, all right. So that's this idea that basically you assume that people are innocent, that are born innocent, that you not only is born innocent, that there is people are basically good, okay, and that you are trying to foster the good in them and also just appeal to the good or just recognize that they're good and not mistreat them, obviously, and to create the conditions for that goodness to be realized and to be used for their own benefit and for the benefit of society overall. So anyway, and I contrast that to Hobbesianism, which is the idea that people are inherently either mixed or bad in some sense, or that they're basically inherently bad, and what we can expect is that the bad that we want to control, a good society controls the badness in people, okay? It controls and also manages foreign conflicts and anticipates that a government, for instance, like Putin's government or another one, will do something bad, and therefore you have to prevent that from happening or meet it at the pass and defeat them, or at least create, engage in aggressive negotiations where you and threat displays of various kinds to minimize their impact on your society. So anyway, and then in my last episode, I talked about the problem of fascism in Ukraine, and or the tradition of fascism in Ukraine, and how that the use of that, certainly by Putin, to justify his invasion, and along with a couple other issues, but that has caused the left to have has trouble perceiving, what Ukrainian society is now, and whether even the Ukrainian portion of Ukraine, in other words, those that speak the Ukrainian language, because there's a Russian-speaking part as well, whether they have any legitimacy. I mean, again, this sounds very pretentious, and and it's ridiculous to say this, but whether they are legitimately a ethnic group or a national group that because of their past sins or their past association, along with many other, the Hungarians were also collaborators with the Nazis, and there were other Eastern European, the Albanians, who collaborated with the German Nazi regime in the 1940s. So it's not as though Ukraine was the only place that had that. But anyway, there are still ongoing groups in present day Ukraine that have fascist tendencies or declare themselves to be fascist. And so anyway, there is an obsession on the part of people, and certainly online, and there are basically apologists for Putin who use this to continually magnify the importance of that aspect of Ukrainian society over the more liberal democratic or also non-communistic left, very small, but anyway, just kind of the overall the general, span of the political spectrum in Ukraine. So that has created this. So I'm sort of talking about two different issues. One is, for the left at least, even though I said they're Rousseauvians, they do allow fascists to be considered to be the repository of evil, and of course with good reason, and which is it is a you could say it's a political ideology that's committed in some sense to evil in a way, and and so it's very, it can be treated that way. It's not an unreasonable way to discuss fascism, and but anyway, the general idea though is that the left's tendency to be Rousseauvian or certainly in a guided way, in this case, it seems to me, by the propaganda, and I'll talk more about this in a future episode, the propaganda instrumentation or the architecture of propaganda and the information war, as you can call it, that Putin has designed over the last maybe decade or so. They've, in some sense, when it comes specifically to Ukraine, they have taken almost completely the perspective of Putin without recognizing it as such, thinking in some sense that they have a difference of opinion with Putin, but still accepting his view of Ukraine, while also I've just had arguments on Twitter with someone or a couple of people actually who say they hate Putin, but they've adopted his view of Ukraine, and therefore also are now justifying the invasion and probably destruction or the attempted destruction of Ukrainian nationhood and many Ukrainian people. So anyway, they are being manipulated in this case by Putin and by his propaganda apparatus. So anyway, overall though, the prospect of dealing with a leader, again, who's misrecognized, Putin, most people who are educated know he's not a communist, but many people still treat him as if he's sort of a communist, or he inherits the communist tradition, which had some humanitarian aspects to it. It wasn't all evil. It was a misguided but very destructive experiment. Okay, and it wasn't. I mean, there were some people who came to power, individuals who you could say were evil. You could say Stalin was evil. You could say Pol Pot was evil. Mao, whatever, megalomaniacal, and very otherworldly, and therefore, and also destructive. And so, I mean, you could probably say that about him as well. But anyway, this Russovianism, though, it's something that I think my position is that I'm not a pure Rousseauvian. Okay, I believe that one needs to do harm reduction and also anticipate that we also have the destructiveness in us as well, and that sometimes there's some people that are more destructive in whatever way, and that we need to meet them with either, in the case of domestically and internally, with some kind of police presence of some kind. You want to maybe call them something else, but still armed people who are delegated to use force to arrest people and to put them in front of the criminal justice system, the courts and so forth and so on. And so, and then as you need, because of what happens internationally, you need a military that can meet the challenges of the world, you know, and or with in combination with other countries. So I mean, sounds all very straightforward, but when you're talking about people who are deeply ensconced in this Rousseauvian worldview, okay, they sort of wish away what becomes obvious when I discuss this. I'm trying to be very general. I'm trying to talk in very general terms, but there are people who, you know, you could say are quite naive, and about some these matters they are naive, or they're just their ideology is such, their need for this assumption of innocence and a boundlessness of an embrace of, you know, a certain kind of hopefulness or whatever about other people, and the idea that one would need to be a little more judicious and figure out, you know, well, you know, there are people who are going to commit crimes, and or there similarly, analogously, there are national leaders who, outside the bounds of your country, that might, you know, cause harm to either your country or to other countries, and so forth and so on. So you need some kind of military alliances and so forth and so on to deal with them, and even then to also facilitate the diplomacy, the endeavor of creating a better diplomatic solution for any conflicts that arise. So there are certain people on the left who like Phyllis Bennis, who have said that, well, no, the alternative to military action or something related to, or arms supply or whatever it is that NATO and or other European countries decide to do with regard to Ukraine, or they do nothing, I don't know, but anyway, or with the next Ukraine, okay, if it's not you with Ukraine, I sincerely hope that this is resolved without that happening, okay, but anyway, that diplomacy works in tandem with military threats, certainly, or the potential for a military response, and so that to just think of diplomacy as a purified good person's action, it's like, well, no, you need the military when you're dealing if you're dealing with an entirely reasonable, good leader. You don't necessarily need the military threat, but you can't assume that in our current world. Maybe if there's some world revolution with, you know, this great new ideology that we come up with, you know, and every leader is inspired by it in different ways, you know, or some, you know, whatever, or their own version of it, something else. But anyway, but it's all, you know, whatever, pacifistic in their orientation. It's like, well, you know, maybe you don't need the military threat, but currently, as it stands, we do need, with some, you know, political actors in the world, that kind of threat, and so otherwise they will push around smaller countries, or even try to push around bigger countries with their own military force. So anyway, so this Rousseauvian assumption of innocence or assumption of goodness, in its purified form, cannot be the basis of a complete ideology, a complete foreign policy. It needs a Hobbesian element, you could say, or an element of assuming that the potential for aggression exists, that you need to prepare for it, and that you also and you can internally in society, but also externally, and the amount of energy you put into that is something else. In other words, the amount of resources you put into that is in the United States overall, it's been imbalanced in the favor of creating this enormous Baroque, it's not even a deterrent anymore. It's simply a weapons carnival, so to speak. And it can act as a deterrent, but it's also used occasionally to bully various other countries. But anyway, so we in the United States have a particular mission to disarm smartly but not based on a complete Rousseauvian, a purely Rousseauvian assumption about the world as being a place of innocence and a place of with no potential aggression or military threats. So anyway, I just want to bring this discussion back to this, I think, a very critical component of both political philosophy and I would say political psychology, and which I think is fundamental to discussions of the differences I see on the left and also just between different groups in society, and what I think is a reasonable solution to it, which in a sort of a general way. So anyway, I will return to this and probably be talking about it in future episodes. So anyway, if you are getting something out of this video, or you like it in any way, just please like and please comment below if you have thoughts about this issue or any related tangents about it. And also, if you're enjoying Politics 2100 in general, please subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.